Hello, and welcome to our third installment of Ear Taxi Festival's webinar discussion series entitled Dissolving Paradigms. I'm Rob Payton, the Director of Community Engagement, and I am joined once again with our wonderful leadership team of the 2021 festival. Thank you for being here. It is my hope and the hope of the leadership team that these conversations we're having become a resource to musicians, students, organizations, and leaders, as well as we all strive to make classical music and the notions thereof more equitable and representative of the vast multiplicity of styles, traditions, and experiences, not only here in Chicago, but also globally. Before we begin, I'd like to remind us all of our discussion agreements, and this is just to facilitate the most effective conversation possible. For those of you who may be watching this, I hope that these are also guides to help you engage with this topic and discuss them with those around you. So the first, lean into that productive discomfort. There is a diverse range of lives and education, identities, and experiences represented here. And this brings friction, but friction sparks new insights. And if we stay comfortable, we'll never move beyond the status quo. So lean into that productive discomfort. Notice power dynamics. Be aware of how you use your privilege in this space, whether by monopolizing time or disengaging. But tend first to your own balance of talking and listening. No shame, no blame. Remember that everyone is doing the best that they can with what they have, even you. Blaming means that you miss an opportunity for insight. And then keep a learning mindset. Share what you're learning and not what you already know. Share your truth, but seek equally to understand truths different from your own. That sound good? Can we all agree to that? Awesome. Today's conversation focuses on the idea of equitable representation in our field and the systems within new music and our society that aid in the overrepresentation of white male Eurocentric experiences. And I am extremely honored to welcome our very special guest for today's conversation, Dr. Andrea Moore.
Hi, Rob.
Dr. Moore is a musicologist with specified study in new music and concert culture. Her work has examined the politics of identity and representation in new music, the structures of musical life under late capitalism, focusing on musical entrepreneurship, multicultural neoliberalism, and the rise of discourse and labor of curation. Dr. Moore, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, really great to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of open us up with a sort of icebreaker, if you will, if I can just pull this up here. So I want us to imagine, just for a moment, a society in which white history has only one designated month per year to be celebrated. How does that look? How does that even feel to you all? This is open for any reactions and conversations.
I think it's funny to imagine that in the sense that, like, when I think of white history, that is so broad, you know? It's like white history is not necessarily white American history. It's European history as well, and like a lot of different forms of European history. And so my initial thought is like, wow, 1 month to cover all of that, which then of course leads to the thought that, wow, 1 month to cover all of Hispanic heritage or all of Black history. It really, you know, puts into perspective what kind of siloing that is in those specified months.
Yes, precisely. Anyone else?
I think normally I wouldn't want to talk so near the beginning of the discussion, but as one of the two white guys here, I actually think I do have a thing to contribute to this, which is that, like, you know, the idea of a single month for white history seems funny, actually, because um, you know, white history is like, as George Lipsis says, is like unmarked. By which I mean like when we say, you know, I think like when you say history in the U.S., like white culture being like the dominant culture, when you say history, you kind of actually mean white history. So the idea of like marking white history as a thing that could be like given a month would is just a very different. We would live in a different society, right? Because like it would mean that like white culture would not be the dominant culture, and like it's actually like hard to imagine, like not in a kind of like value laden sense, just in an actual normative sense. Like it's hard to imagine because like um, precisely because it's the dominant culture, like it doesn't let you imagine outside of it or something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm interested in sort of what would be kept if we're putting white history into a single month. What would be kept? Because that's a pretty severe process of streamlining. What would fall away? What would make it into White History Month? What would be celebrated? And then, for the purposes of our conversation, would classical music make it in there at all? Right? I mean, our associations with classical music are, sort of this bastion of whiteness, which is accurate. But if we are siloing, as Justin said, white history into a single month, is that one of the things that we end up with? Do we end up with I don't know, is it like a month-long celebration of other other white genres of music instead?
Right, right. And you actually just touched on the next question here, which is what changes would have had to happen in order for this to even be possible? Where do we have to kind of adjust in our society to even make white history 1 month per year? And Michael, to your point, when we say the word history in our country, it's already assumed that we're talking about white history. And I also want to be clear about and I'll speak for me, I'll use I statements. My use of the word white in this conversation does not necessarily depict a particular person, but it depicts, again, as we will come to discuss, a system of an idea even that doesn't really make sense, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. Often in these conversations, when we're talking about diversity and equity and access and inclusion, we hear these words thrown around in conversation like underserved or underrepresented. When we talk about even having a designated month for other groups of people, we talk about them being underserved and underrepresented. And we talk about that to describe the lack of those varied experiences in a particular field. However, refocusing and challenging our language to talk about the actual overrepresentation of homogenous groups allows us to operate from a true acknowledgement of the overwhelming abundance of the diversity that exists. Understanding that when we talk about who is left out of these spaces, we actually mean, Jenny, I think you coined this term, at least for me, the global majority. And I think that this is especially true in classical arts, and particularly in classical new music. Dr. Moore, in your thought-provoking commentary in the Chicago Tribune, and I really have to state this title because it's so good, Beethoven was born 250 years ago. To celebrate, how about we ban his music for a year? Amazing, top tier, all the awards, Oscars. Um, you state, for an artistic tradition that has struggled to articulate its ongoing relevance, a crucial question might be how much compelling new music is going unheard, both by those from within the tradition and those whose music has had very little presence in the concert hall. And I think that this is extremely valid and poignant. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your years of study that helps you make this conclusion?
Yeah, so that's really less of a conclusion. It's not really a rhetorical question, it's a real question, what aren't we hearing? And it kind of begs the question in a sense, right? Because we can't know what we don't know. So what kinds of new music are being unheard because of various factors, people not coming through, the so-called proper channels of music education, right? Where we have all, I think, probably forged our networks, the people that we know, the people that we've performed with or worked with or studied with, people working in other genres or speaking languages that aren't English, or, maybe German is not as dominant as it once was, but speaking non-European languages, for example. These are all questions we can ask when we go to examine the issue of what is being silenced within the framework of the concert hall. And silenced is a strong word. I think silenced suggests a kind of intention, which is maybe slightly distinct from neglect, from deliberate neglect. Sorry, slightly distinct from neglect, but at this point, I think we have to start taking responsibility for what happens, whether or not we can explicitly find motivation or intention within ourselves and our practices, if that makes sense. So, unheard. I mean, we think of these concert institutions, these classical music institutions, as gatekeepers to some extent. They're certainly gatekeepers to resources. But on the flip side of that is this kind of marvelous potential, or this marvelous opportunity to have a much more expansive vision, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely caused us to kind of be a little bit more intentional, for sure, about, or we've started to have the conversations about being a little bit more intentional in these spaces. And you actually kind of bring me to my next kind of conversational point, which is how has society reacted to some of the events of 2020? I mean, it's no secret that there has been kind of an upsurgence of this intention, this kind of reality after 2020, with the pandemic, with the murder of George Floyd. How do you think, or how does anyone see that being, or how it might have impacted classical music in some way?
I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, there was certainly this sort of deluge of statements, right? That would make for an interesting archival project, I think, to gather all the statements made by classical music organizations or other big arts institutions. In fact, that's, it's giving me an idea. I should make a note, because it would be really remarkable to, partly for accountability, but partly also, for reasons of other interest. That was the first thing that happened. I think institutions were making statements of a sort that they had never made before. Now, the pandemic has gone on longer, I think, than anyone hoped it would. And so the start of this season has not been the kind of, wide open doors that we may have hoped for. So if there is going to be transformation, if there are institutions out there planning truly transformative seasons, I don't know that we're going to necessarily see it right away. We may end up with more of a reform than a revolution, which is its own interesting tension and its own can of worms. Truly, I think reform is probably a lot more comfortable for the kinds of institutions that we're talking about than really sort of blowing the doors off the church.
Yeah, I think, like, speaking on, the deluge of statements that came out, I think it's clear that a lot of that was reactionary and not necessarily things that were like truly like central beliefs to some of the organizations that were making these statements. I think it was, it felt necessary at the time to not be left out in being one of the people making those statements, and so it makes me wonder, how much of that is going to be followed through by these organizations, and in part, if you zoom out from just the context of classical music, but you look at like sociopolitically, right after the murder of George Floyd, you have this big swell of support for Black Lives Matter, and since then there's been a dip in support, even lower than it had been before the death of George Floyd, and so it really makes.
Justin, you cut out.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
It makes me wonder how much is honest and how much is just feeling like this was the right thing to do in the moment, and who's going to be actually doing the work when rubber meets the road.
Exactly that. I was going to actually mention, in thinking about literally the chain of events that happened, we saw the pandemic hit and all of these classical institutions were quite literally fighting to survive. And then here is an opportunity to make a statement that may gain you some sort of notoriety, if you will, in the grand scheme of being able to perform, being able to produce new works, et cetera, et cetera. You have to make a statement to survive. That's just one of my observations, but did anyone else want to comment?
I have a question, actually. I'm just curious. Like Andrea was talking about reform versus revolution, and I don't know. I mean, this is certainly a thing that I wonder and think about a lot. But like, I'm curious to know people's thoughts on like, what would a revolution, let's say specifically in the field of classical music, look like? Again, speaking of like, I talked about whiteness as a space that's hard to imagine outside of. Similarly, classical music is a space that's hard to imagine outside of in some ways. But I'm curious to know if people have like specific ideas for like, how would we know if it were a revolution?
I have to say, Laurab and I have talked about this a bunch of times. As the demographics of the country change and as it essentially flips so that it's not white majority, I mean, I just think that there's just going to be much more of a celebration around featuring and highlighting diverse voices. I don't think it's just a matter of like charity, like, oh, it's time that we feature these other people. I think, truly, I think culturally, I think more and more people are just seeking to hear from diverse backgrounds and diverse voices and diverse cultures. I think that's something that artists and audiences are all craving. And so when I think about this reform, I really think it's going to have to come from that place, because otherwise it's never going to happen. It's all going to be performative. It's all going to be superficial. It's got to come from this sincere valuing and appreciation and celebration of a diverse representation, not only of voices, but stories and histories and personal stories. And to me, that's where that true reform is going to come from. And there's an organization here in town that months prior to making their what is it, that anti-Asian hate whatever, had all sorts of like ridiculous representation on stage, and when people complained about it, complete silence. But when it's time to post the anti-Asian whatever, boy, there they were. And since that time, I'm sure nothing is going to be really any different. And it's not until these people with these really sincere efforts to make those voices heard and to make those voices represented, that's when we're going to see the true reform, in my opinion.
It's an interesting, I mean, it raises a kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? Because you say more and more people are going to want to hear different perspectives and hear different kinds of music and see different people represented and so on. And I think that that's absolutely true. But then they're going to run into, even in new music, they're going to run into the old audience. right? So who's going to make the first move?
Right. That
Is it going to be the institution that does the programming? Say, you don't know you don't know you want this, maybe, but you do want this, or you can be taught to want this. And I think that goes to something, that new music has tried to do for decades, right? Beginning with, say our friends, the serialists, trying to train audiences to like what they didn't like, or whatever, or thought they didn't like, or whatever it is, right? The same way that, people still freak out when they see Schoenberg on a program.
yeah, new
120
music by
years
Schoenberg,
later. Yeah, exactly. So, but it's an interesting question. Like, who's going to be bold? Will it be the audiences making demands of the institutions, or the institutions nudging the audience?
Well, I think part of it is when we think about the audience. I've shared with these guys before. I have a brother-in-law that basically he has a brother that's like a for real punk musician. Like, he's made his livelihood playing concerts all over the world, and it's like completely insane stuff, and really incredible and really brilliant. And he is this huge fan of new music. And in fact, he knew Raven Chacon. I mentioned to him that we're playing the music of Raven Chacon. He's like, oh yeah, I knew Ray. And, but the thing is that he comes at it from a perspective of, what he calls noise. Like, he just wants like the really, really crunchy new music. And he's coming at it from the complete opposite of me, coming through conservatory training. He's coming at it more from like, just the rock side, the punk side, all of that. And that's where I think that there is just a much broader definition of audience. And when we think about like our CSO audiences going to want to hear X, Y, and Z, I mean, probably not. But there are others, I think, that are really eager to hear different things.
Yeah, I think this is all very interesting. I'm curious too, Andrea, you mentioned, the chicken or the egg, and I'm kind of seeing some sort of a process almost of revolution, redefining, and reformation kind of being necessary for everybody involved, whether you're in the, in the audience, or if you're a part of the institution. There has to be those three steps: this acknowledgement that there is more, an acknowledgement that the definitions of classical music or new music have been static and like super exclusionary, and then the complete shifting of the structure within classical music, and the reformation of the structures that happen. It's very curious. Yes.
I'm just chewing on that sequence, right? And wondering, going back to Michael's point or question as well, it may not be that there's a moment that you can point to as the revolution, right? But instead a sort of sequence of revolutionary acts that might be smaller, that we might see only in hindsight, that happen, let's hope, right, over the course of many years, rather than, because it's something that happens once. Yeah, I mean, after an event like that, it's still sort of easy to fall back into your pattern, so maybe it will be ongoing. And it's likely, I think this goes to what Jenny was saying about the CSO audiences, it's pretty likely to be taking place in the smaller organizations, right? The ones that are that have the room to be more daring, and that don't have to raise the kind of money that these big institutions absolutely have to do. But one thought I did have when Michael was talking about revolution, was like a revolutionary act would be, an organization like the CSO turning over its budget for the year, to a group of Black artists, for example, who are maybe classical music adjacent or completely detached from it. Turn over the hall, turn over the money, whatever it is. I mean, maybe the musicians could still get paid. It seems pretty important, actually. But right, the other, I mean, but that does bring up the economics of the kind of music that we're talking about. And I don't think, we're all people, it looks like, who have a livelihood, a stake in this music in terms of how we pay our rent. And it's one of the risks of revolution is that that could all disappear, right? If we really want a kind of radical access and a kind of radical inclusivity, the professionalization of the art may be a consequence of that. Yeah.
Yes. Michael, did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think like to that point about like imagine an orchestra turning over its budget to the ACM for a year or something. Um, right? That was actually the only thing that actually occurs to me that would be revolutionary, and this might just be a testament to my lack of imagination, is actually like the fact. So, I mean, we should say that I think like, or to put, I would put the version of that imaginary a little bit differently, which is that I actually imagine less the CSO giving over their budget and more like philanthropic organizations like dissolving themselves, right? Which say that I don't know. This might just this might just reveal certain kind of political predispositions of mine, but I think like it's hard for me to get past the U.S. sort of arts sector reliance on philanthropy as a structuring force, right? Which say that like you don't have to do it like that, right? Germany doesn't do it like that. Mexico doesn't do it like that, right? France doesn't do it like that. There's a lot of countries that like just fund their arts very differently than the U.S. does, and it's always sort of been my sense that like the fact that the U.S. has a particular kind of tax code that means that philanthropy is a kind of like that fact that like philanthropy is based on accumulated wealth and generational wealth, and we know the ethnicity of the people that have generational wealth. So there certainly is a sort of intersectional, like, as Bell Hooks says it, like the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, like it's always all three of those things. It's not just like one or two. But yeah, it seems to me that the revolutionary act that I could imagine would be for philanthropy to completely changes how it funds the field. And I think also to Andrea's point, that would cause problems for a lot of people, and not that maybe those people need to sacrifice some things, that might actually be like an under considered point within this whole discourse, is that it's possible that like some of us need to do some sacrificing. But I'm also imagining like other kinds of revolutionary modes. Like, are there musical revolutionary modes that we could see a hegemonic cultural institution engage in? I'm just not sure, and that's why I was asking. I'm curious if y'all have any thoughts on that.
I wonder if we could hear from Phoebe. Phoebe's a fairly recent graduate, and she'll have a different perspective from all of us. What do you think, Phoebe? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I guess the philanthropy does the way that classical music is funded completely creates the structure, and the way that it's funded applies to concert series. It applies to like colleges as well, universities. And I think somebody said it, we all kind of a gate that you have to pass to do new classical music for almost everybody is getting a degree, going to college, doing this kind of thing. So I think that would have to be a place that changes drastically in order to make any real change.
Oh, go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I think Phoebe brings up an excellent point of the gatekeeping that happens just through the collegiate journey, and what doors are opened and closed to people as a result of what schools they are able to go to. It's a really excellent point.
I do feel like things are changing slowly recently, but it is more along the lines of reform and not revolution for sure.
It's interesting to consider the dissolution of the big foundation, right? The dissolution of Mellon, or I don't know, even Guggenheim, right? These big sort of unimaginable accumulations of wealth, which currently, right? I mean, they have the advantage. First of all, yeah, those are basically money laundering operations, right? Historically, it's sort of like how to clean your money. how to make your money look good. But also, you know, currently they have the advantage of generating significant amounts of income, which then flow to, in a restricted way, the kinds of projects that we're talking about. Whereas if they're dissolved and the money is dispersed, which it should be, maybe that's, you know, maybe we dissolve the foundations and pay reparations, right? And leave it at that. I don't think the government's going to do it, right? I don't think the government's going to make reparations. So, but then what? Then this source of income is gone. And what does it get replaced with? Where does it get replaced, right? Or do we just go to this sort of other model where there isn't really a professional life to be had in the arts, which I think is an interesting model. Yeah.
Actually, sorry, and by reparations, you mean like just, you mean of the sort of political sort, specifically like the not specifically within the artistic sector, but just more general. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much money is in these foundations, but I imagine, you know, you could they could make some start at reparations, say, to the descendants of enslaved people and to indigenous people, for example. Which again, I don't think the political will seems to be missing to sort of force the federal hand on that, right?
Well, this is an interesting thing that I think kind of we keep touching on slightly is this idea of the need for revolution, right? And in that, recognizing the force against that is wanting to uphold the system that works for the very few folk. And when I mentioned earlier, even this idea of whiteness as a system, here it is at play. In order to see this equitable art reform or art revolution, it requires a risk. And that's not a risk that whiteness wants to take. And specifically here, when we're thinking about wanting to dissolve these institutions for reparations, there will always be that force against, because whiteness wants to remain at the center. It wants to be the person, you know, it wants to uphold itself, to generate and accumulate the most amount of wealth. It wants to keep things exclusive and keep certain people out of these conversations. So when we're having this conversation about revolution and reform and redefining, even, there is still that semblance of white centering that happens in this conversation that I think is really interesting when we start especially when we start talking about wealth and who gets to generate wealth and where that wealth even goes. Phoebe, I want to give you an opportunity to say what you were going to say, but
yeah, Andrea, I was gonna ask you a question. So if the philanthropic institutions were dissolved, but for somehow federal funding for the arts got boosted and was much more significant and made it possible for people to, you know, continue to live off of this. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that would be significant change, or do you think that it would be kind of the same people with a different name?
You mean if the arts were primarily funded by the state rather than by private money?
I do, yeah. But it would still, it's still like a larger institution of a sort.
Yeah, I don't think there's much chance it would look very different. Right. If you comb through, I mean, the NEA is kind of a sort of a sorry shadow as a funding body, which is no fault of anybody who works at the NEA. But if you look at the kinds of things that they fund, I mean, it's about as safe as it gets, right? And that's partly because they were put through the ringer in the 80s and the 90s and forced to scramble for their budgets every year, and, you know, hauled in front of Congress again and again to answer for, you know, obscenity charges and this and that. So that really took a toll on the NEA, and they've really have changed their granting structure many times since then. But it has tended to grow more and more, maybe I won't say conservative, but safer. So I don't necessarily think, unless an entity like that were, you know, committed to funding, let's say, funding only BIPOC artists for a period of 15 years, something like that, or institutions, I don't think it would look much different. I don't think it would look much different, you know, but reparations might have been paid, and that's not nothing, I guess. The other thing I wanted to add to what Larab was saying about, you know, whiteness wanting to accumulate, and whiteness also wants to be seen as generous, right? There's that desire to be the entity that is dispensing the funds, that is keeping, you know, keeping culture alive, or whatever is the sort of fever dream of that kind of philanthropy.
For another conversation that we should have another day is how that trickles down into the personal, very personal affectations of whiteness when we start to talk about that interpersonal conversation and dialogue. Woo, there's much there. I'm going to share my screen really quickly because Andrea, you mentioned to me in our previous conversation that you were here in Chicago visiting the Art Institute, and that you got an opportunity to see the Visa Butler exhibit. And the conversation that you and I had alone from this you know, incident or story, I just would really love for you to share that and some of the insight behind what you experienced.
Okay, I think I was muted. Yeah, there was quite a moment. So first of all, I don't know if other people got to see this show at the Art Institute, but it was, and I've been following her for a while, and it was just absolutely spectacular to get to see these pieces in person. Just a really, really extraordinary experience. But one of the things that happened when I was there in the rooms where this exhibit was that there was a guy probably in his 30s who was very interested in this work, a white man in his 30s, who kept quite literally centering himself in front of the work. So the labels were down below at floor level. So he would come and stand in front of it and then very sort of dramatically kind of hunker down to read the labels. And so, you know, there was a lot going. I just kept observing this. There was a lot going on. There was a lot going on in this moment. First of all, to be fair or to be generous, one or the other, I think he had a genuine interest in the work, right? And fine, great, but seemed unable to have a genuine interest in the work without making sure that everybody around him knew that he had this genuine interest in this work, and without quite literally displacing other viewers, right? You know, without quite literally centering himself in front of the work. And it was so potent. There were so many things going on. There were so many things wrong with how that was happening. And yet those were actions that would be, I think, almost invisible, right? Certainly they were not visible to him. There's no way he could have understood how that was being perceived. You know, and one of the things that I thought while visiting this show was that it would really probably be a marvelous thing if at least one day a week that show could have been only open to Black viewers. I don't think it's something, you know, that the Art Institute, huge, right, could probably ever pull off. You know, but I saw the same thing. So the day that I was there, the Obama portraits were also on display. I don't know if they're still there at the Art Institute. And, I hadn't seen them, so I sort of made a dash through the museum to go. And, you know, they'd built all these rooms for them and so on. At the end of these many rooms, you come to the Obama portraits, and that room was packed. And it was really the same kind of thing. You know, there were many Black viewers in the room, but sort of at the front of the room and taking all the selfies with the portraits, that wasn't the Black viewers, right? And so this way of sort of where white consumers of art, white viewers, white listeners, literally center themselves in front of the work of Black artists, it couldn't have been a better case study, really, in how that happens, as it was at the Visa Butler show. And of course, it made me think about, you know, white audiences for Black new music, or non-Black audiences, right? for the music of Black composers and the music of Black performers, and what the expectations are, the invisible, unstated expectations. So one of the things that sort of keeps coming up is the idea of, other experiences and other voices and other stories. And I obviously that's crucial, but at the same time, does that carry with it an expectation that, and I'm going to talk specifically about expectations of Black artists, because I think maybe this falls on Black artists most heavily, I'm not sure, that Black artists are going to deliver to non-Black audiences particular kinds of narratives that are going to be narratives of pain in particular, that are going to be narratives of overcoming, of being heroic in some way, right? That non-Black audiences are maybe not necessarily so open to, the Black abstractionist, the Black formalist, right? The person who's trying to do something really new and interesting in formal terms. That there may be some expectation that people are gonna show some suffering or things that are very personal or private. And we are in a confessional age. I mean, there's no question we're in a confessional therapeutic moment. But nonetheless, that seems to make a demand maybe that should not be. I would go ahead and say should not be made. And I am curious to know what the rest of you think about that.
I think like actually three examples come to mind immediately of like exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. That one is that's it. Three come to mind. One is I was talking to Renee Baker, and she related an anecdote to me where like a white sort of concert presenter was saying how interested he was in her works, and specifically said that I'm interested in your intuitive non-Western approach to music, is what he said, and like Renee was understandably offended, because she's just a freaking classical viola player who plays viola. I mean, who does a lot of other stuff too, but is like trained as a classical viola player and like did new music, and she was not happy
and
with
was
that.
Principal in an orchestra for like
exactly,
decades,
yeah.
and
George Lewis tells a story about a photographer from a foundation coming to take a photo of him, and like the photographer, it's the big fancy foundation is giving him a grant or something, and George of course is like the head of composition, is the area chair of composition at Columbia, which say like you don't get more like. It's Columbia University is the composition program. He's the head of the area chair, and this photographer kept wanting him to grab his trombone. And what George wanted to do was take a photo of himself like in front of a score that he was working on, like composer photo. But like this like of course George is a great trombone player, but it was like this photographer had in his head that like George Lewis is the improviser, the kind of, George calls it the trope of the ecstatic Negro. That like that was kind of being, and then another one actually is like my own personal experience. Many years ago, Del Niente was considering commissioning music by Jeffrey Mumford, who's I think he was at Oberlin at the time, and I didn't know his music, so I listened to some of his music, and thought it was cool, and was like, yeah, it's kind of like Elliott Carter but prettier. And then like looked him up and was surprised when I found that he was a Black composer, right? So that was like that was an interesting moment for me to be like, oh wow, I like didn't realize that what I had in mind when I hear music that's kind of abstract and like this is I think of a white male composer. So anyway, those are just the three kind of anecdotes that occurred to me as Andrea was speaking.
I'm still hung up on non-Western, intuitive non-Western. Non-Western. I mean, non-Western, that is a truly shocking thing to say, right? It's that's maybe even more shocking than intuitive, although intuitive is pretty shocking too. Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's like everything else is it's only defined by its like attitude towards the like Western,
I think another interesting point in all of this, and even your examples, Michael, is to kind of think about the implications of what it means to, um, I don't know if I have the right wording, but to have the right to be a creative in this space. Um, you know, Andrea, you mentioned that oftentimes Black artists are well received when their work centers around the suffering and pain of their experience. And it kind of touches a little bit on what you mentioned about this need for whiteness to be generous, if you will, to acknowledge the pain of another group of people by appreciating the art when it is centered around that pain and trauma, if you will. So again, another, another conversation we'll have one day, and I say this, I know I've said this to this group before, but in my study and research, it comes to me that whiteness is a psychosis, if you will, because it really creates this delusion of situations, particularly like this, where the presentation of my pain or my trauma gives you the right to justify that pain or trauma by appreciating it or by qualifying my existence in this very white space. Um, it's a very interesting place to be.
Even riskier is the idea, not just that you justify it, but that you consider it then resolved. Right. The story's been told now. Right. We've clapped. We've been moved. Which I think is genuine. People are genuinely moved. I think the guy at the Bisa Butler show was genuinely moved, and as the rest of us were kind of stunned by the materiality of these pieces. But then considering in some way that the story is then closed, right? There's a period at the end of it. I think that's a real risk, yeah, of appreciating these kinds of stories, right? And not appreciating other work. I want to keep the focus sort of on both, or just reiterate both sides of that, right? Not just the risks of white appreciation of Black pain, to sort of put it succinctly and bluntly, but also, the possibility of opening more space and opening more appreciation for other forms of work that people might want to be doing and might want to be supported for and should be supported for. Yeah.
I have a good friend who's a Nigerian American composer, and he recently got a substantial commission, and they said it was unrestricted. He could write whatever he wanted. And it was like the biggest blessing to him, because so often people are like, I want you to write about this Black experience or this experience. And it's like, he just wants to compose. And it was just amazing how refreshing that felt to him, especially in this time where people feel like everything has to have meaning. And it's like, that you're putting people into like a straitjacket when you tell them what they have to write about, instead of taking someone who, if you really respect their talent, you'll just let them use their talent the way they want to use it. But one of the things that I feel like we keep kind of hovering around is this idea of just white centeredness, and this sort of constant desire to kind of put white culture and white perspectives like right in the center of everything at all times, and how huge an impact that has on our field and on our art and on our experience. And what's interesting, Andrea, is I'm sure you're absolutely right that guy had no idea what sort of impact he was having on the experiences of the people around him, because he probably moves through his entire life like that. When he's waiting in line, he's somehow at the front of that line, and that it's just something that I think people who are so myopic and so in their own universe, they just don't have a sense of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Centering his own appreciation of the work rather than getting out of the way of the work. Yeah.
And
I guess we're talking a lot about counter-revolutionary ideas to some extent.
And also just the idea of sharing the experience with people. Just that basic sense of there's 20 other people here with me, but those 20 other people don't matter.
They don't need to be as close to the work. Yeah. These were crowded rooms too.
Yeah. So this actually brings me really, really well into my next point here. So I'm going to share my screen just once more, at least I think once more. So when we talk about creating in classical spaces, particularly for artists who are frequently excluded from these spaces, there's this acknowledgement that we have to have, again, about obviously what the classical space is and how it's operated for so long with this kind of white centeredness, but then also how other people get to show up in these spaces as well. And unfortunately, in the United States, especially, all people have to engage with these spaces through the scope of race, which we know to be completely made up and nonsensical, non-scientific, illogical, and exclusionary. However, it's one of the largest systems at play when we are negotiating how we move in this space and even in life. And it weighs on how our experiences, it basically determines how our experiences are weighed and our access to value in this society. So the system of whiteness that I keep talking about, or race, we can call it race, these are social constructs. And this is really just for the edification of those who are watching. But systems like race are social constructs, and they communicate value, and they dictate how and what should or should not be done in these spaces. And they're determined and enforced by those in power or by consent. And power here is the ability to impact another person's life by prioritizing your own beliefs and biases and comfort over others. So we saw in that very amazing example at the Bisa Butler Institute, where this person in his own blindness, is centering himself so that he has access to this experience and to this art. And therefore, Bisa Butler's art is not necessarily being centered and not being, it's not being able to be fully even communicated to those in the room because there's this centering of whiteness in that space. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of touch on is this idea of white gaze, GAZE, and just in that, like, it stipulates what is allowed, and often it commands a certain level of that whiteness to even be granted access into that space. And when we have this conversation about equitable visibility, what it really means to have a free-flowing system of expression and experiences in classical music, particularly in new music, what does that mean to then have all of those experiences and all of that art viewed by whiteness, or qualified by whiteness even? And how do we address that? I don't know if that question was rhetorical or not, but I welcome anybody to respond.
Something that has been kind of swirling around my head this whole time is, the concept of code switching, and I think more specifically, like artistically code switching, and when we have a structure or organizations where the default is white music and white culture, there is sort of an unspoken expectation that there has to be a level of code switching done in order for it to be accepted. And as I'm thinking about what does the revolution look like when we look back at this revolution we're talking about, and we say like we have been a part of a revolution, I think a big part of that is spaces where non-white creators are able to create without the need to code switch. And I don't know if that means that the people who are doing the commissioning or the presenting, the people in power, are non-white voices. But I think that, you know, as whiteness is still the default, which is, you know, that is obviously the case with our very first question about thinking about history is white history, and our default for, you know, just for normal terms has the implication of whiteness in it. I think like a big part of getting away from that is, you know, having the structural powers not be white structural powers.
I agree with you, Justin. It's interesting. Very early on, when we were starting to have these conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I kind of, you know, the word inclusion really started to rub me the wrong way, because inclusion implies that there's somebody who has the power, again, to let people in and let people out. And I often talk, I know this is really tired for those who hear me say it all the time, but I often kind of think in this idea of, you know, inviting people to the table. That's always thrown around. We have that conversation when we talk about inclusion. And the problem with that is we invite them into the room, we invite them to the table, but we serve them what we want them to eat, as opposed to asking, what would you like to have here? Or asking, what can you do? What can you provide to this table? What food would you like to cook? And let me taste that. You know what I mean? So yeah, thinking about who is in the room when these decisions are being made, and how do we distribute the power of that table equitably so that everybody has the opportunity to speak for themselves, to create for themselves, without this idea again of whiteness being the overseer in the room and saying that it needs to happen this one way, or that it has to happen according to this exact system. It's a very, very important point you just made, Justin.
Do you think that takes us back, though? It's back as well to the distribution of resources, right? It's like the table metaphor, if we just take it one step further, is, you know, turning over the whole damn kitchen, you know, to people, and you know, and the power to invite people to the table by extension, right? But those resources are still located, as has been pointed out by multiple people, right? Those resources are still located in particular hands and in particular institutions. On the other hand, right, the issue of inclusion, I don't think that just sort of replacing all the white administrators is going to, you know, is going to bring about the kind of transformative music that maybe we would like to see, or would like to have a chance to experience, as certainly as an audience member now. I would love to be surprised at a concert, you know, now and then. I mean, I'm sure we've all been going to lots of new music concerts for decades, and you know, in candor, I don't hear that much stuff that surprises me, right? Where I feel like I'm really hearing something original. When it does happen, it's thrilling. When it does happen, it's thrilling. But I think that that's an experience that could be cultivated by other means, right? By means of a really radically expansively inclusive vision. There could be a lot more kind of gripping, thrilling surprises in the concert hall.
Mm-hmm.
It could be.
Thank you for using the word radically, because I didn't want to leave this conversation without using it at least once. But especially to Jenny's points earlier about this kind of call for this authentic expression. People want to hear an authentic story. and that there's a need for this radical shift in music abroad, but particularly, and definitely new music that has been for so long academic. It's been for so long exclusionary. It's this like high form of art that only certain people get to have access to. There still needs to be this true and authentic expression within the field that allows for all of those different expressions and their meanings to come into the conversation. And just to touch on that a little bit, I feel like too often we separate the composers or artists' experience from what their capabilities are in the composition. The composition has to kind of meet this, again, academic standard before we can even really appreciate it for its authentic story, if you will. So I'm curious about what that looks like in the music space as well. One of the things that I just kind of wanted to, and I'm just trying to move us along in the conversation, is, again, what is equitable visibility and what does it mean? How do we be equitable? And I guess maybe highlighting that in order to be equitable, this is a process. So in this conversation, we brought up 1,000 different ways in which we could kind of reach whatever the goal of equitable visibility is, but acknowledging that it's a process and that there are many questions that have to be answered along the way. And two of them that I thought of right away were, what challenges do communities face when they're navigating, this space, when they are being excluded from new music spaces? What are the challenges that they face, and what portions of these challenges and social constructs have we all aligned with in new music in particular? I could think of one of them, which is just academia. We talked about it a little bit before, this idea that you have to have had the degree and you have to have gone to school. These are challenges and constructs that keep people out. So how do we address those in the field?
I also want to add to that this whole idea of meritocracy and who's the best, who's the right fit, and the way that those terms get used so easily to essentially exclude certain people. And certainly the idea of the right fit, there's a lot of ways that people who aren't in sort of these right sort of cultures are easily deemed as not being the right fit, even just from the name on a resume.
And Jenny, we skipped over this a little bit, but to that point, there's this toxic cult of genius in new music and in classical music that we fall prey to quite often, that you've got to be really smart and really good in order for it to really be valued.
I guess the issues of virtuosity as well, right, for performers. I mean, maybe the cult of genius is attached more to composers. I don't know if that's still the case, but there's almost historically at least a kind of cult of virtuosity, right? Like who, we all have spent countless hours shutting in the practice room, right? Building chops. To what end? I don't think we're ever necessarily encouraged to ask to what end we're doing that. But the other thing to remember is like there are kids out there in their bedrooms, in GarageBand or using other kinds of software, right, who are doing the same thing. They're out there and they're shedding day after day and they're shedding every night, and they don't have the same kind of visibility in new music circles because they're not doing it in a conservatory practice room, or they're not doing it in a community music school. But the shedding and the sort of drive for technical ability is the same, albeit without the sort of baggage maybe that's attached to those of us who came through conservatory. Yeah. Can I give? Oh, sorry, Michael.
Just like as a I was like, right, exactly, like in what I'm trying to think of, like what are the non-virtuosic musics that I know, and I guess I'm like your scratch orchestras, and then do y'all know that Sun Ra album called Strange Strings? Do you know this album is like where Sun Ra, like he just like gives his band a bunch of like string instruments that they don't play, and they're like, what do you want us to do? And he's like, just play when I point to you, right? So it's this totally like it, and it honestly it's like it sounds like new music. Is the funny thing. It's like and which is always a thing that really is fun and exciting. But it's like but it's definitely like he called it a study in ignorance. And I actually am like I'm very interested in this idea of like yeah, I mean does outsider art do that, or you know, and ignorance is obviously I think like a strong word, but like what would be, this is just a very specific question that is the result of what Andrea said, or that occurs to me after what Andrea said, which is that like yeah, what is the kind of like antidote to like the virtuosity pathology or something like that? But Andrea, I think you're going to say something different, or you can respond if you want. But thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I teach an experimental music class, usually in the most spring semesters, and you know there are a lot of text-based experimental pieces that people can do with absolutely no musical background whatsoever. You know, if you can read them or if you can understand them, if somebody reads them to you, you can participate in them, right? I mean, that's you know that's we all sort of know that about experimental music, right? Some of the Fluxus pieces, but also a lot of you know just they're out there, they exist by the hundreds probably, you know, and that's can be a really marvelous and participatory experience. Or you know the sonic meditations, right? That's another really kind of classic I would call it canonic case of inclusive, genuinely potentially inclusive musicking, right? But what other forms of non-virtuosic music making? I don't know. I think I think it's kind of a marvelous question and potentially future direction, though, right? Can we get away from? I mean, for me, so I'm a very former at this point percussionist, you know, and like my chops were just never that great. I could do some things really well, but I'll tell you what, like certain things just eluded me. I just literally couldn't get my hands to do certain things after years of trying. And I think that was a big part of what drove me out of performing. And now I see colleagues of mine doing kind of very deliberately non-virtuosic percussion work. And it's a really marvelous thing to witness, right? It's kind of opened up my perception of what's possible.
I want to just kind of again keep challenging us all, because we mentioned this word radical, and now I'm seeing, you know, how do we challenge these, even some of the language that we're using here, virtuosic, like as opposed to like, I mean, I don't know, just playing. You know, there's like this radical redefining that has to happen across the field, if you will. We kind of talked about those 3 points, this like revolution, redefining, and reform. And this is one of them where we have to really kind of assess what it means to be anything.
To belong in those spaces, I think, reassess what it means to belong in those spaces, right, which have been the space of genius and chops and technique. And, you know, new music is, I had a professor in graduate school who always talked about, he called it the arms race between performers and composers, where composers tried to write things that were unplayable, you know, and then performers would catch up to that level, right? So that's been a big part of the space of new music, but it absolutely doesn't have to be the only thing.
You know,
and what it means to belong in that space. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was just thinking along those lines. I have this ongoing struggle with the whole idea of canon, and it's precisely for both of the reasons that you just cited. One is that, you know, generation after generation, composers up the ante, performers meet it, and then composers up the ante, and then performers meet it, and then those things become canon. And then you've got 18-year-olds playing things that used to be considered impossible for professionals, and they reach a point like what you were saying, where they're physically hitting these limitations, and then all of a sudden deciding that performing is no longer for them. And you know, it's just this cycle that really goes completely against what should be the artistic spirit, right? Of expressing something that's just like deep inside, period. That's it. And where would we head if that became sort of the basis for how we choose repertoire and how we choose what we're performing, rather than make sure you got your Bach sonatas, make sure you got your Beethoven in, don't forget to study those Brahms symphonies. And I love all those pieces. I mean, those pieces to me are like, they're like they're like the lifeblood of my upbringing as a musician. I love them, but that doesn't have to be the only definer of what we do. Anyway.
An anecdote that I think ties in. Like a moment for me that felt kind of revelatory was I was in a restaurant in a town in Mexico once, and there was a guy playing violin just at the restaurant, but he was playing it left-handed, like opposite of how I had ever seen anybody hold a violin. And prior to that, it had never occurred to me that that was even an option. And this guy was, you know, living his life, playing great, sounded amazing, doing something that like up until that point to me was an impossibility. And that is, you know, sort of, I think, what it looks like when those structures are broken. It's, you know, somebody doing something that really is not all that revolutionary. It's like Hendrix did that. Like, you know, it's just like he's playing how is comfortable, and he may not be, you know, at Carnegie or something, but that to me is an example of like an artist creating from their true self in a way that is without these boundaries, and that has for good reason, that's stuck with me. That was years ago that I saw this, and I like still think about that all the time, because that is like kind of the first point for me of like unlearning a lot of that the like conservatory mindset.
Mm, yes. One of the things that you kind of brought up, Justin, is again this idea of and I think this is kind of what everyone is talking about here, is the idea of agency and versus power. And you know, I think whiteness in classical spaces has always had the power to move the bar, to be like, nope, this is the standard. Nope, this is the standard you have to meet now. Okay, this is the standard now that you've met that. And what does it feel like for each individual to come into this classical space with full agency over who they are, over how they express and how they make music? And it begs the question to all of us in this space currently, when did you feel like you had the most agency over your art in classical spaces? That is a question.
Well, to speak for myself, Andrea, I am also a percussionist, and I also am a percussionist without like lightning fast chops. That is very much not my bag. But like, and for me, one of the things that felt like I had agency over like my own art making is I performed some improvisatory vibraphone through a pedal board, and it was, you know, like just making noise um and doing washed out spacey things, and I like really deal with personally feeling like that doesn't really have a space, and it took a lot for me to get to a point of like presenting that work in like publicly, because there is this hill to climb of like, this is not what people want to hear. And so you know, that holds me back from it. And um I don't know that I necessarily have an answer for you, Laura, but I mean like I understand that, and like the moment when you do get to present that is like is huge, and you know, it can be life-changing for somebody, and having those spaces and those platforms are you know, one step towards getting there.
And I'll be clear that maybe I didn't mean to suggest that everybody should answer that question exactly, but to maybe just think about the fact that in order to have agency in this space is to consider what it looks like and what it feels like to be able to produce authentic art without and outside of the confines of whiteness. And outside of the confines of what we already assume classical music and new music looks like.
I'm gonna bring up maybe the whitest, most European male composer, and that is Stockhausen, because I am writing about 9/11 memorial music right now. And I don't know if anybody remembers the Stockhausen controversy around 9/11, where it was in the same month, it was September of 2001, he made these remarks at a press conference about how it was the greatest artwork imaginable in the cosmos or something like that, right? And these were, you know, before we threw around the word canceled, he was certainly canceled, right, in a very real way as a result of these things, because they fell outside of the framework of acceptability. But in, you know, 20 years on in sort of analyzing this situation, one of the things that really strikes me is how high he thought the stakes of art were, right? And I think especially in new music, which just, you know, which struggles materially, struggles for listeners, it struggles to sort of present itself in, you know, as an artistic form that speaks to the moment. I think, you know, retaining a sense of the political stakes, of the emotional stakes, of just the seriousness of the endeavor and its potential to be transformative, you know, for people, I think is probably one of the most important things that we can do as we work toward maybe more concrete and more specific goals. That you can't probably become more radically expansive without a sense that the stakes of not doing so are very high, right? This isn't a marketing opportunity, right? I mean, I think somebody was talking about the statements, right? The statements in support of BLM, the statements against Asian hate, as it was called. Yeah, sometimes those seem cynical. They seem like branding. They seem like marketing. But the stakes are actually higher than that. The stakes, or they should be higher than that. We should all feel the urgency of using the thing that we care about so much as a transformative tool. You know, not as a marketing opportunity or professional development. Maybe those things too. But to think of this as urgent, as, you know, having some kind of life or death attached to it, is probably the most important thing, to not lose sight of that, I guess, right? What draws us into it. It's not just, you know, playing cool concerts and having a really fun hang afterwards, although that's great. I just want to bring in the issue of stakes, I guess. And one last thing, I was talking a lot, but I also want to just say that there are still canonic interventions to be made too. We're talking a lot about new music, which is, I think, where a lot of the potential lies, especially because those tend to be smaller groups, smaller budgets. They have more flexibility in that sense. But I just want to talk briefly about this film I saw by Heartbeat Opera Company. Is anybody familiar with Heartbeat Opera? Yeah, you're familiar with Heartbeat Opera. So they had done a staged performance of Fidelio, which I didn't get to see. And then during the pandemic, when there were no performances, they made this film called Breathing Free, which spoke so profoundly to 2020, right? Where the question of breathing and who could breathe and who could not breathe permeated American discourse. And it's an intervention into Fidelio. It's a really marvelous opera film. And so I was thinking, you know, and it's an all-Black cast. So casting Fidelio with an all-black cast, this is a great move. It's a move of inclusivity. It's a DEI move, and it's a good one. An all-black Fidelio, I'd buy tickets for sure. But an even better move is what happens during Florestan's aria when in Breathing Free. So he sings the first part, the slow part where he's talking about how he's in the dark and in the dungeon, but he feels okay because he's done his duty, and he has a vision of Lenore coming to rescue him, right? So it's this vision of freedom that is very internal and very subjective. And what they do in Breathing Free then is they disrupt that aria with Malcolm's aria from Anthony Davis's opera, right? So in the film, you have this very subjective internal notion of freedom that is then truncated by a very different idea of freedom, right? A demand for freedom in the world and in material conditions that then, lands right in the middle of Florestan's aria. And that to me was a really incredibly potent moment. So casting an all-black Fidelio, fantastic. Cutting off notions that, the best we could do is have sort of internal freedom with a really powerful political demand was even better. So that's just an example of a canonic intervention, among other things. Yeah.
Actually, I kind of just want you to say more about stakes. I don't know. I think that's such a great, that Stockhausen example is such a great example. I think I'm gonna go check out this Fidelio. But I'm curious, like, okay, certainly like a thing I feel like I get caught up a lot in is something like where like some undergrad composer like wants to write an anti-capitalist piece, and they go and they write an anti-capitalist piece, and they have their friends play it on a stage, and they think they're being revolutionary, but they're a bunch of kids, white kids in a university, like, which say, and I think there's also like definitely adult versions of this, right? There's like I shouldn't like smear undergrads because there are definitely composers that get paid a lot of money to write anti-capitalist pieces that just get performed on a stage by middle class player, or like get performed for middle class audiences, and so it's like I think I don't know, like another way of putting this question is like I spend a lot of time trying to like emotionally grapple with new music's irrelevance, and sort of wondering like what's the correct solution to that, right? Which say that like I think like there's some people I think that sort of think that that don't want to pretend, and that seems like a reasonable move. So there are people there are people in the new music community that I think think things like, you know what, let's not try to actually reach out to audiences because like, what are we doing? We're kidding, like orchestras do this stupid outreach stuff and it's like doesn't work and it's dumb and it's so let's admit that what we're doing is we're a small group of people that want to bow stuff, want to bow cymbals and marimbas and things, and like that's okay. We can just like write pieces for each other, yeah, and and I find that a refreshingly honest take. I also find it very unsatisfying. Especially living in a place like Chicago where there is like we have musical communities that have like just extremely widely varying levels of, let's just go with straight ahead economic inequality, right? But I also don't think that necessarily that like the Roscoe Mitchell piece that Damiente commissioned is gonna make more money go to the AACM. I mean, maybe indirectly, but that's not, I'm just curious if anyone has any thoughts on, I like this idea of stakes, is what I'm saying. I see everyone has great answers.
I mean, I think a belief in the significance of the work that you're doing, whether it's commissioning Roscoe Mitchell or doing an outreach project or whatever it is. I think that we come back to professionalization. Part of the professionalization process is a sort of immersion in the ideas of of outreach and of the idea that somehow you're going to convert people to the art form, which is going to be better for you and trickle up to the orchestra or whatever it is, right? I mean, I think that this is familiar to us. Some of us probably went through entrepreneurship training and, you know, all of these things, but really, I mean, I guess the question is, you know, what are the stakes to each of us, and what are the real stakes, not the stakes of what our chops are or what our budget is or whatever it is, but, you know, are there real stakes to the work that we're doing? Are there what matters about it, and to whom, and what can we do with it? You know, are the stakes, are they worth it? You know, are they worth it to us? And if they are worth it to us, then that should be motivation enough to do everything we can to become as expansive in our visions as we possibly can, I think.
Yeah, Michael, I think that all of our pauses is not that we don't have responses, but that it's such a massive question. And it's one that will probably take our entire lifetimes to address, and we probably still won't address it fully. But I know, like, when I was in high school, and when I talk to high schoolers, and they share with me, you know, I really think I want to be a music major. I really think I want to be a musician. And, you know, I'm sure we all feel the same way. It's like, don't do it unless it's like the only thing you can imagine yourself doing. And if you feel like it's something that if you don't do it, it's like there's a part of you that dies. And I think that when I think about like the stakes, when there's like an entire body of artists that have that same commitment, that same feeling of calling and identity, like to me, that's like something beyond who we are as individual people. It's like a calling of the universe somehow that is, I mean, this is going to sound arrogant, and I don't mean it to be, but it's a calling that like really matters within the grander scheme of humanity. And I think that there are just a certain body of people that understand that that's what their life needs to be dedicated to. And however that shapes up, whatever trajectory that takes each of us individually on, it's that same passion and that same focus. And it can take different shapes and different forms, but that same sort of like, this is my identity, this is what I was put on this earth to do. I have to think that somehow matters in the grander scheme of things.
If I can, I jump in. Is that again? So I'm going to push back on that just a little bit, Jenny, and just I think draw a distinction between a personal sense of vocation, right, which is to say a powerful sense that this is your calling, and a sense that maybe art itself has stakes in the world that go beyond the individual sense of calling or sense of vocation, right? I guess, or that means something different. I guess that means those are two different things. And I just think if we're going to be thinking about the stakes of the work, yes, I think that is partly has to come from the love that you're describing, but also it is absolutely a matter, I think, of thinking beyond ourselves, right? That's where the stakes get really high. And I may be arguing against something that you didn't actually say. I'm realizing that as I say it. Yeah.
But I was actually trying to articulate in the same way of being part of a grander movement, and not necessarily focusing on the individual, but on the larger body. So yeah, I have to say I agree with you in that sense.
It's a really interesting thing to be a moderator of a discussion like this, because in both statements I was hearing like, yes, exactly the same point. But exactly that. I think when we have these conversations about equitable visibility, one is this process of undergoing an idea of revolutionary thought, of radical thinking. And it requires an acknowledgement of art being so important to us as humans and as a society that we are willing to undergo the process of rethinking and reformation and redefining in all the ways that are challenging to for the benefit of society, for the benefit of humanity. And Jenny, to your point, those who experience art in that form of, dire, circumstances, those who are willing to give their all and their lives to art are so frequently those who fall far out of the scope of whiteness, who do not understand art to be in creation, this idea of rigidity. And I think we have put this rigidness on what art is and how it's made and who determines when it's good, that it becomes something different that's not natural, if you will. I'm of the mindset that art actually comes directly from communities, and particularly communities who have experienced a world without whiteness. And so what does it look like to reframe our thinking and reevaluate what it means to be art makers outside of the scope of whiteness? There will always have to be this kind of undergoing, if you will, of and actually I have it written here, this tension between advancement and dismantling that will always be happening when we're having this conversation of what it means to be equitable in our field.
I sort of fear we haven't actually addressed that at all.
I was gonna say.
So we haven't actually certainly put forth any concrete proposals for greater equity other than the redistribution of resources, which I stand by, right? A kind of radical redistribution of resources, whether that's at the institutional level or, the example of, an institution giving up its budget, or Jenny's example of her friend's commission, right? Where it's like you hand over the resources for whatever this person wants to produce. I think that's the most concrete thing we've got. And maybe it's a place worth really throwing our weight behind, because it doesn't exist yet. It's not like we can say, well, we tried that and it didn't work. We can't say that at all. Not at all. So, maybe the redistribution of resources, maybe it's not the most, maybe it's not the loftiest idea that we have, but it's, getting money into people's hands so they can make their work is a pretty serious endeavor. It's a pretty serious undertaking, handing over your curatorial role to somebody, or, you've got a rehearsal space, handing over your rehearsal space, whatever these things, whatever the resources are that we have, and that probably white artists and then non-Black artists more broadly, have hoarded, have hoarded to some extent. Handing that shit over. That's pretty concrete.
I think a lot about the younger generation, and one of the schools that I teach at, a huge number of my students are first generation college students, many of them from immigrant families. A huge number of them are paying their own way through college and working and having to provide for their own health insurance. And then, I contrast that with, I knew a high schooler who, she was a sophomore in high school. So what is that age? Like 15? And her parents bought her literally a $70,000 flute. And so how do I reconcile the difference in privilege for these students that are the same age going into the same field with all the same dreams? And one's going to have a wide open pass, and she knows all the sort of mannerisms and behaviors and how to look and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And she's a world-class talent, immensely talented, hardworking, sweet as anything, not taking anything away. But at the same time, then there are these other students that, they're playing on a $200 instrument. And yet at their core, they have that talent and they have those dreams. And so how do we even get them on equal footing is not even an option, but approaching that. And to me, that's a huge gatekeeping moment right there, to do what meager thing that I can to enable them to at least be able to pursue their passions. But what's always interesting to me is that a lot of times those students care nothing about classical things. They don't care about orchestra auditions. They don't care about all of the conservatory trappings. And they have a much more sort of authentic sense of like, here are the things that I want to do, especially the ones that are also composers. For them, like, they don't feel limited at all. And they see the artistic creativity of what they want to do as being completely on par with anything that, you know, if I handed them a list of orchestral excerpts, they would question the validity of that. And for me, I think that there's so much power in that. And there's so many ways that they can move into the world confidently and really embrace their own path. And a lot of them have gone on to pursue careers that they find extremely fulfilling. So, anyway.
Yeah, it's just making me, I mean, the thing that you said about she knows, what did you say? She knows how to move in that world, basically, or she knows how to have these conversations, your younger student. I mean, it goes back maybe to something that Justin said about code. It goes back to code switching to some extent, which is to say that it's a form of gatekeeping that is largely invisible to those of us within it, right? How do you talk to people? Concert etiquette, right? And that's maybe the most notorious example. All of these codes that you learn in the process or you don't learn in the process become another way of gatekeeping, as does the quality of instruments. But I was just struck by that because that's something that that tends to be invisible to us.
That's absolutely right. And that's, that whole concept of, are they the right fit? It's those types of mannerisms that a lot of us aren't really privy to and don't really understand.
Yeah, fit is lethal. The concept of fit.
Dr. Moore, I'm sorry, Andrea, one of the things that I think, your point about redistributing like the wealth of the organization, the wealth of art or classical arts, I think is probably one of the most concrete ways to start to see that change, really, because when we think about, does a person fit, how would we show that person that they do, other than to offer them the resources to advance in the same way that someone who, as Jenny said, has the $700,000, $70,000 flute, it's sort of the only way that we need to be trying to do that. It's redistributing the wealth of these organizations and handing it over to those who have the authentic story to tell.
I mean, for concert programmers, maybe that's especially, hand over one of your concerts or something to somebody else. I mean, because that is a resource too, right? It's experience, it's access to an audience, it's access to visibility. It also gives you a chance to create access for others, right? To bring other kinds of voices in. So, it's the rest is sort of ideas to be toyed with and to be played with, and hopefully, all of this will continue to make us think about how to become more and more expansive. Expansive, I think, maybe is my preferred term over inclusive.
Yeah.
Maybe it just has less baggage than inclusivity at this point, but by giving away the resources, that's sharing the hoarded wealth, basically. In all of those forms that we've talked about: rehearsal space, concert programming, actual money, instruments. That's all wealth.
Yeah, I think along those lines, I truly wish this was my insight, but it's not. It's a former student of mine's insight that, like, speaking of the Art Institute of Chicago, and speaking of concert programming, my student had this very simple insight, which is that, you know, you've got the Art Institute of Chicago across the street from the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. And, you know, you go to Art Institute of Chicago, and of course, mostly what you see is your European paintings and your stuff, but you actually see a lot of different kinds of art, right? Like, you see ancient Greek art, and you see Japanese art, and you see Sumerian art, and you see from all different time periods, and you see the Obama portraits, and you see traveling exhibitions, and you see like, and you sort of think of the idea of the Art Institute of Chicago as like, as an encyclopedic institution, right? That's actually like one of the things that it does. And you might disagree with how it does it, right? You might disagree with how it handles its indigenous so-called artifacts, right? But you go across the street to like the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and like there are 5 names that are like written on the top of that building, and I don't remember which ones they are. It's like Schubert. It's like one of them's a weird one too, like, you know, Wagner is one of them, maybe even like really grossly. But it's like, you don't go to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, you don't hang out in the Symphony Center and hear Iranian traditional music or Indian classical music or mariachi, or sometimes you hear some jazz because they have a present series or something like that. But the idea of the symphony orchestra as an institution just doesn't do the same. And you couldn't have like CSO musicians playing Iranian traditional music, right? Because they're just trained in a very specific way, you know. But I do think like, I think the idea of programming, expansive programming, let's put it like that, is a really, to me, exciting idea. And also, I see a lot of challenges to, like, you know, I wish I knew better how to get started. You know, maybe commissioning Roscoe Mitchell is, you know, to write a piece for a new music ensemble is partially that, and like there's plenty of crossover, but seeing that in kind of mainstream classical music seems, I don't know, it's a lot of issues.
There's, I guess, I mean, you mentioned presenting series, right? You know, it's like a large institution has the resources to umbrella other kinds of series, right? So there's programming and having your sort of home team in the form of the CSO or whoever they are, right? Your sort of full-time home team. And then there's also, you know, redistributing your resources in such a way that other voices come in and you don't have to pretend that you know, because as you say, you know, the CSO is not sort of equipped maybe to put on even a concert of like Makam or something, right? But taking on a kind of presenting role or fostering other people who want to do that kind of concert presenting within the confines of the existing space, the existing budgets, and I mean that might be one sort of direct route to redistribution. Maybe, you know, not just commissioning from within the home team, right? The CSO is going to play this. That's great, but using some of that money also to bring in a more encyclopedic. I mean, they're never going to be encyclopedic, but yeah, right. A more expansive vision of what music is. Thought.
And you know, what better way to bring in sort of non-traditional CSO audiences is to expand the tradition that's offered there. But maybe that's too risky.
It is risky, but it's necessary. I think that's what we're saying, is that the risk to not do it, to not consider it, is worse. You know, the stakes then are worse to not do it. We risk losing everything. You know, Andrea, you mentioned in your article about, you know, pausing on Beethoven for a while to incorporate some of the new music that already exists. We get an opportunity to appreciate the Beethoven by allowing other people to become normal in the space, if you will. We get a new vision of what Beethoven even is when we incorporate the music of some other composers, or do the hard work or risky work of commissioning different artists instead of doing the same old in this field. So I think I would say I think this is a great place to kind of conclude, really, in this idea that, you know, some takeaways. We have to be, you know, revolutionary. We have to be risky, and we have to redefine and reform this this art form really, and ask the questions, redistribute the wealth, and be prepared to take the risk of being more expansive. I like that word a lot. In how we start to program or even just acknowledge classical music as a whole. You know, a thought that I've had for a very long time is that art is evolutionary and it's emergent. And new music should be no different. Classical music should be no different. We have to start including these voices because we have to, and that's just that.
Yeah, I wonder, you know, maybe risk is something worth thinking about the same way as thinking about stakes, right? Maybe even more. I mean, if we try to think about what's revolutionary, it can be pretty overwhelming, and we can feel like our imaginations are just failing us. But if we think about what's really a risk, what's a place where what's a way that I can really raise the stakes in this moment? What's a real risk? That might be one way to start to take these kinds of steps, steps that may yield actual palpable kinds of changes, which again, I think are going to happen on a small scale. And so critical mass of those kinds of small scale moments is probably the aim. Also, you know, your point, Larab, that we risk losing everything just seems like such a metaphor for kind of wealth hoarding or hoarding of privilege in general, right? That we'll risk losing everything to hold on to the little bit that we have. And I think we can take much more interesting and productive and exuberant risks than that. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing? You know, and I just feel like, Andrea, what you just said about this whole idea of wealth hoarding is like the perfect circle back to one of our first topics about white centering. And it's just sort of like this larger sort of practical way of seeing how this functions in the field. So yeah, this is just such a fascinating chat. I'm really grateful to everyone.
Likewise, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for having this conversation today. I mean, I feel like I'm walking away with at least 5 new words to use as we start to have these conversations with other people. So thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Moore, for joining us today. Everything that you contributed to this conversation has been extremely golden. I mean, seriously,
Thank you.
I'm walking away with information that I definitely should have paid for. So thank you so much.
I love having these conversations. I really do. So thank many thanks to all of you for having me. This is really a joy.
Yeah. So again, I leave you with these parting words that art is evolutionary and emergent. So everything else should be too. Thank you all so much for talking and have a great day.
See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.